I thought I was grieving in peace, sorting through my mother's things while my father sat in the next room pretending to mourn. I had no idea he had already called a lawyer, or that the evidence he had spent 3 weeks carefully constructing would put me in front of a courtroom before the year was out. The detective who called me on a Tuesday morning in October was polite, almost gentle, the way people are when they're about to deliver news that will crack your world in half. He said my father had filed a formal complaint. He said there were documents. He said I had the right to remain silent. And I remember thinking, silent about what? About the fact that I had watched my mother die by inches over 14 months, holding her hand every single day while my father golfed and attended dinner parties, and found subtle ways to be somewhere else whenever the hospice nurses arrived. I had nothing to be silent about. I had done nothing wrong. That is what I told myself, standing in my kitchen with the afternoon light falling gold across the linoleum floor, my coffee going cold in my hand, the detective's voice a distant hum in my ear. I had done nothing wrong. It took me another 3 weeks and a stack of forged documents to understand just how completely I had underestimated my father. My name is Clara. I am 37 years old, and for the past 2 years I had been the sole caretaker of my mother, Margaret, who was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's in the spring of the year I turned 35. I was the one who drove her to the neurologist on a rainy Wednesday morning and held her hand while the doctor explained what the scans meant. I was the one who called my father Richard from the hospital parking lot, standing in the drizzle with my phone pressed to my ear, listening to him sigh heavily and say, "Well, that's a lot to process. Can we talk about this at dinner?" I remember the way the rain felt on my face, cold and thin and relentless, like the first draft of grief. I remember thinking, my mother is losing her mind, and my father's first instinct is to schedule a conversation about it. My mother had a house. That is the thing you need to understand first. Not just any house, a pale yellow Victorian on Elmwood Drive, with a wraparound porch and a garden that she had tended for 30 years with the devotion most people reserve for prayer. She had bought it before she married my father, paid for it herself with savings from a decade of teaching 3rd grade in the same elementary school where I had once been her student. The house was hers. That had always been clear, not just in feeling, but in legal fact. The deed was in her name alone. My father had moved in when they married, and he had lived there for 26 years as if it were his own, rearranging the furniture, replacing her antique fixtures with modern ones she quietly hated, hosting poker nights in the living room she had always imagined for quiet Sunday mornings with tea and books. But the house was hers. It smelled like her. Like lavender sachets and old paperback novels and the particular warmth of a wood-burning stove in winter. And I think, on some level, my father had always resented that. He lived in it, but had never quite possessed it, and men like my father need to possess things. When she got sick, I moved back in. My apartment was a 20-minute drive away, and I could have managed the commute, but that would have meant leaving her alone with my father, a man who responded to her confusion with impatience, who referred to her episodes as the drama, who once, and I have never forgiven this, told her to just try harder to remember when she couldn't recall whether she had taken her medication. So I moved into my old childhood bedroom with its faded lavender wallpaper and the window seat where I used to read, and I became, by necessity and by love, her primary caretaker. My father tolerated my presence the way a cat tolerates a visiting dog, barely and with visible effort. He was cordial at breakfast, dismissive by noon, and by evening had usually found a reason to be out of the house. He played golf 3 days a week. He had a standing dinner reservation at Harrington's with his friend Gerald on Thursdays. He attended a men's Bible study on Sunday mornings that seemed to involve more bourbon than scripture, based on the smell of him when he returned. He was, in short, largely absent. And I told myself that was fine. That was actually better. It meant my mother and I had the house mostly to ourselves, and in those quiet hours I cherished what I still had of her. She had good days and bad days, and the good ones were enough to keep me going through the bad. On her good days, she would sit with me on the porch in the late afternoon light and tell me stories I had already heard 100 times. About the summer she spent in Portugal at 19, about the time she accidentally taught an entire lesson on the wrong chapter and didn't realize until a child raised their hand. And I listened to every single one as though it were the first time, because sometimes it was, for her. I made her chamomile tea the way she liked it, with a thin slice of lemon and just barely enough honey. I learned to brush her hair in the slow, careful way that didn't pull at the tangles she no longer noticed. I held her hand during the bad episodes when she didn't recognize me and called me by her sister's name, and I answered to it because it made her less afraid. My father was not present for any of this. What he was present for, I would come to understand much later, was a series of meetings with a financial advisor named Douglas Hale, whose office was in a glass building downtown and who apparently specialized in something my father called estate planning, and what I would later come to understand as asset repositioning before a spouse's death. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I told myself I was being paranoid. It was a Sunday in February, and I had come downstairs early to start the coffee before my mother woke up. I passed my father's study. The door was cracked, just barely, and through the gap I saw him at his desk with a spread of papers, talking in a low voice on the phone. Nothing unusual about that. But then I heard him say, "The house would need to be transferred before probate opens," and a cold, specific kind of stillness settled over me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the house. I stood in the hallway for a moment, my hand flat against the cool plaster wall, listening to him say something else I couldn't quite make out. And then he turned slightly in his chair, and I moved away before he could see me. I made the coffee. I stood at the counter and watched it brew and told myself that estate planning was normal, that it was responsible, that a man whose wife was ill would naturally be thinking about the future. I told myself all of these things in a very deliberate and organized way, the way you arrange furniture in a room to hide the cracks in the walls. By the time my mother padded into the kitchen in her robe, blinking at the morning light and smiling when she saw me, I had almost convinced myself. But the feeling didn't leave. It settled in my chest like a stone, quiet and heavy and permanent. And over the following weeks, I began to notice other things I had been too exhausted and too absorbed in caregiving to register before. My father began asking about my mother's jewelry, casually, in passing, the way someone asks about the weather. "Do you know where your mother keeps the good pieces?" he asked one evening, not looking up from his newspaper. "She was asking about them," he added, which I knew was almost certainly not true, because my mother hadn't asked about her jewelry in months. I told him I wasn't sure. He nodded and said nothing more, and I filed it away beside the phone call and the cold feeling, and tried to focus on the reason I was there. My mother's condition declined rapidly in March. There were stretches of days when she didn't know what year it was, when she called for her own mother who had been dead for 20 years, when she would wake at 3 in the morning and stand at the window in her nightgown, looking at the garden with an expression of such absolute bewilderment that it broke something in me every time. The hospice team recommended increasing her care to round-the-clock supervision. My father, who was present for this meeting in body only, he sat with his arms crossed, looking past the hospice coordinator's shoulder at a point on the wall, agreed to whatever was recommended, and then left for a dinner with Gerald before the coordinator had finished her notes. It was during this period that I found the first document, not the definitive one, not the one that would eventually make my blood run cold and my hands shake so badly I had to sit down on the kitchen floor. That one came later. This first document was a printed email, folded in thirds, tucked into the inner pocket of my father's coat, which he had left draped over the kitchen chair. I found it while moving the coat to hang it up properly, because my mother had always hated clutter in the kitchen, and old habits are powerful things. The paper slipped out and fell onto the tile floor with a soft, almost inaudible sound, and I picked it up without thinking, assuming it was a receipt or a grocery list. It was neither. It was a message from Douglas Hale, the financial advisor, and the subject line at the top read, R.E., Transfer of Property, Elmwood Drive. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, standing very still in the kitchen with my mother's coat hook directly in my field of vision, and the smell of the soup I had left simmering on the stove, suddenly too strong, too thick, almost suffocating. The email referenced the amended arrangement and the window before cognitive incapacity is formally declared, and ensuring the transfer is executed while signature capacity can still be argued. I didn't understand all of it. I understood enough. My hands were not shaking yet. I was very, very calm in the way that the sky is calm before a tornado. I refolded the paper exactly as I had found it, slipped it back into the coat pocket, and hung the coat on the hook behind the door. Then I stood at the kitchen sink and ran cold water over my wrists for a long time, the way I used to when I was a child and couldn't sleep. And I stared at the garden through the window. My mother's garden, with its February bare rose canes and the stone path she had laid herself, one slab at a time, over the course of a summer 20 years ago. My mother died on a Wednesday morning in April, with the early spring light coming through her bedroom window, and me sitting beside her, holding both of her hands. She had been unconscious for 2 days. Her last coherent words to me, spoken 4 days before she died on a morning when she'd been unusually lucid, had been these. "The house is yours, Clara. I need you to know that. I always meant it to be yours." I had told her not to talk about such things. I had smoothed her hair back from her face and told her we had plenty of time. I was wrong about that. But she was not wrong about the house. My father did not cry at the funeral. He stood at the graveside in a dark suit that fit him too well, his face composed, his hands clasped in front of him, accepting condolences with a quiet dignity that struck me, even then, as more performance than grief. After the burial at the reception at Harrington's, he had already arranged it, had already spoken to the event coordinator before my mother had taken her last breath, which I learned afterward, and which told me everything I needed to know about the nature of his mourning. He placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "We'll get through this." And I nodded and drank my wine and watched him work the room. He was good at it. He always had been. That easy, polished charm, the firm handshake, the sincere eye contact held for exactly the right number of seconds. My mother had once called it his superpower. I was only now beginning to understand that it was also his weapon. 3 weeks later, the detective called, and I stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had made 1,000 cups of chamomile tea, where I had read medication labels aloud and tracked dosage schedules on a notepad stuck to the refrigerator, and I listened to the detective tell me that my father had accused me of stealing from my own mother's estate, that he had documentation, that there were signed affidavits. My coffee was cold, the afternoon light was gold, and somewhere in the back of my mind, that stone I had been carrying since February shifted, slowly, deliberately, and became something harder and much, much colder than grief. I did not call my father back that evening. I sat at my kitchen table until the light outside went from gold to gray to the deep blue of early October evening, and I thought about everything I had filed away and explained to myself over the past 8 months. The phone call about probate, the questions about the jewelry, the email from Douglas Hale, the way my father had never once, in 14 months of my caregiving, asked me if I was tired, the way he had never thanked me, the way he had stood at my mother's grave with dry eyes and left the reception early, and I had told myself he was the kind of man who grieved privately, and I had been generous in that telling. I had been generous about almost everything when it came to my father, and look where generosity had brought me. I called Diane that night. She'd known me since we were 9 years old and had a gift for clarity I had always envied. I told her everything in a breathless rush, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Clara, you need a lawyer. Tonight if possible. Tomorrow morning at the absolute latest." She said she would call her cousin Marcus, an estate attorney in the city, and that I should not speak to my father, the detective, or anyone else until I had spoken to him first. Then she said, very quietly, "This was planned. You understand that, right? He planned this before she was even gone." I said I knew. I had known since February. I just hadn't let myself know it all the way. Marcus called me the following morning at 8 o'clock sharp. He had a calm, measured voice and the habit of asking questions in a precise order, and within 20 minutes he had a clear picture of the situation. He told me to gather everything: medical records, caregiving logs, receipts, any correspondence about the estate, and the email from Douglas Hale, which I had photographed on my phone the night I found it. He also told me something that made the floor tilt slightly beneath my feet, that under the laws of our state, a property transfer executed while a spouse was in a diminished cognitive state could be challenged as fraudulent. He asked if I had any reason to believe such a document existed. I thought of the email. I thought of the phrase, "signature capacity can still be argued." I said it was possible. He said, "Then we have work to do." The meeting with my father happened 4 days later. He had called and asked me to come to the house to go through a few things together, and Marcus advised me to go, to listen, and to say as little as possible. I drove to Elmwood Drive on a gray Thursday afternoon and sat in my car for a long moment, looking at the pale yellow facade, the wraparound porch, the rose canes pruned into their winter shapes. The house looked the same, yet I felt, sitting there, as though I was looking at a photograph of a place I used to love, not the place itself. My father opened the door before I had knocked. He was wearing a press shirt and his reading glasses, and he smiled at me with practiced warmth. The house smelled different. The lavender sachets were gone, replaced by a plug-in air freshener near the door that my mother would have hated. Small, deliberate. The erasure had already begun. He led me into the living room, which had been partially rearranged. The armchair my mother used to sit in, the one with the faded blue upholstery and the wooden arms she had worn smooth over decades, was gone. A new charcoal gray piece stood in its place, looking as though it had arrived that week. I sat on the sofa across from him and folded my hands in my lap and waited. "I want to talk about the estate," he said, settling back with the ease of a man who believes he has already won. There are some irregularities, things that were moved or accessed without my knowledge. He paused, watching my face with careful attention. I don't want this to be adversarial, Clara. I want to handle it as a family. As a family, the phrase that means, do what I say, or I will make this much worse for you. What irregularities? I said. My voice was perfectly even. I had practiced that in the car. He opened a manila folder and set a printed document on the coffee table, pushing it toward me with 2 fingers. Your mother had a savings account, maintained in her name only. In the 6 months before her death, there were several significant withdrawals. He tilted his head slightly. Do you know anything about those, Clara? I recognized the account immediately. My mother had added me as an authorized signatory so I could manage her expenses. Hospice co-payments, specialist appointments, medication insurance didn't fully cover. I had made withdrawals. Every single one was documented, receipted, and recorded in the log I had kept with the meticulous care of someone who knows they may one day need to prove themselves. Those withdrawals paid for her care, I said. Every cent is documented. He smiled. It was a small smile that did not involve his eyes. The documentation you provided to the estate appears to be incomplete. My attorney has found several gaps. He paused again. Weapons, his pauses, used with precision. Given the amounts involved and the fact that you were the authorized signatory, the situation looks concerning. Another pause. I've also spoken to Detective Reeves. As a precaution, I really do hope we can resolve this without it going further, Clara, for the sake of your mother's memory. For the sake of your mother's memory. I stood up, picked up the document, folded it in half, and put it in my bag. I'll have my attorney look at this, I said. He blinked, very slightly. And I thought, good. Marcus called me at 9 that evening with something beneath his careful voice that I had not heard there before. He explained that some of the hospice payments had been made in cash at the facility's request, and without third-party records to corroborate them, the withdrawals were difficult to account for on paper. Which means, I said slowly, it looks like I took it. He said, on paper, yes, and your father's attorney is very good at paper. That was the night I stopped grieving and started fighting. I drove to the hospice facility the following morning and spent 4 hours with the administrative coordinator, Patricia, who had known my mother by name and remembered me from 2 years of weekly visits. She pulled every record, sign-in logs, payment ledgers, handwritten receipts from the cash box kept in a binder in the back office. She made copies of everything. She also wrote a letter on facility letterhead attesting to my consistent presence and involvement in my mother's care. When I hugged her on the way out, I had to press my lips together hard to keep from crying, because it was the first moment in a week that someone had simply, uncomplicated, been on my side. The second twist came from Marcus on a Friday afternoon, and it hit me like a fist through glass. During his research, he had discovered that 6 weeks before my mother's death, when she had been largely nonverbal and requiring full-time supervision, a quitclaim deed had been filed with the county recorder's office, signed, apparently, by my mother, transferring the house on Elmwood Drive into joint tenancy with right of survivorship into my father's name. The signature had been notarized by a woman named Sandra Yates, the wife of Gerald, my father's Thursday dinner companion, the same Gerald he had been dining with every week for 2 years while I changed my mother's medication schedule and tracked her cognitive episodes in a spiral-bound notebook. I sat in my car in the parking garage and did not move for a very long time. My mother had been nonverbal for 6 weeks before she died. She had not signed that document. She had not been capable of signing it, which meant my father had forged her signature on a legal instrument transferring her home, bought before their marriage, in her name alone, and had had it notarized by his friend's wife, and had then turned around and accused me of theft in order to discredit anything I might say about what he had done. It was elegant in the way that terrible things sometimes are, the plan of a patient man who had spent years waiting. I called Marcus and told him to file the challenge to the deed. Then I called the one person I had not yet thought to reach, Aunt Ruth, my mother's sister, 71 years old, who had despised my father for the entirety of their 26-year marriage with a thoroughness that had always impressed me. Ruth did not hesitate. She had been waiting for this call. She had copies of letters my mother had written her over the years expressing concern about my father's interest in the house, and a handwritten note dated 3 months before my mother's death, witnessed by Ruth herself, in which my mother clearly stated her intention to leave the house to me. Ruth had also attended one of my mother's final lucid neurologist appointments and heard the attending physician record that my mother did not wish to make any changes to her estate. She was prepared to testify. The hearing was set for January. My father arrived with his attorney, Douglas Hale, and Gerald, all in dark suits, all with the calm of men who have not yet been told they have lost. I arrived with Marcus, with Patricia's letter, with 847 hospice sign-in entries spanning 14 months, and with Aunt Ruth, who sat in the third row in a red coat and did not take her eyes off my father for the duration of the proceedings. When the judge reviewed the notarization, there was a silence that was different from all the other silences. Marcus had discovered that Sandra Yates's notary commission had lapsed 8 months before the date on the deed, rendering the entire document legally void. My father's attorney leaned toward him and said something low and urgent. My father's composure showed its first crack, small, barely visible, like the first fracture in a wall before it collapses. He looked at the table. Then he looked up directly at me, and his expression was one I had never seen on his face before. Not calculation, not anger, but something much smaller and colder, which I recognized after a moment as the look of a man who has realized he miscalculated. The judge voided the deed. She ordered a full forensic review of the signatures on both the deed and a second document, an alleged amendment to my mother's will, produced by my father's attorney, signed supposedly 6 weeks before her death. The forensic handwriting analysis, completed 6 weeks later, found both signatures inconsistent with my mother's documented writing samples from the prior 18 months, tracked as part of her cognitive assessment. Both documents were determined to be forgeries. My father was referred to the district attorney's office. Douglas Hale's professional license was placed under review. Sandra Yates faced charges for fraudulent notarization. Gerald, I heard through Diane, had stopped returning my father's calls. The house on Elmwood Drive passed to me 6 months after the hearing. I stood on the wraparound porch the evening the title transferred into my name and looked at the garden. Still waking up in early spring, the rose canes starting to show the first green tips, the stone path exactly where my mother had placed it, one slab at a time. And I breathed the cold air and felt something I had not felt in a very long time, solid ground beneath my feet. The father I had lost was not the one who had died, but the one who had never, it turned out, truly existed. That loss was its own particular kind of mourning, and I was not finished with it, but the house was mine. On the first warm Saturday of April, I made chamomile tea the way my mother had liked it. Thin slice of lemon, just barely enough honey, and carried it out to the porch and sat in the afternoon light. My father had built his entire plan on the assumption that love was not enough, that care was not evidence, that a woman who had spent 14 months holding someone's hand had nothing to show for it. He had been wrong about all of it. In the end, it was not a lawyer or a judge who undid him. It was my mother's own handwriting, consistent, careful, preserved in 18 months of medical records, that told the truth he had tried to bury. She had been speaking all along. He had simply assumed no one was listening,